the Bible is filled with people who used to live this way, and we hear how now they live this way, completely different. And the difference maker was the presence of God in their lives. So last week we looked at the life of Zacchaeus, from greedy to generous, a man who loved money, who that was his thing. That's what he loved, that's what he followed, that's what he worshipped. And he was a greedy man who took advantage of others. Jesus took a hold of him. Jesus changed his life, and now he was known not for stealing and being greedy, but for his generosity. He was known for being a selfless person, right, who will give to others, and the gospel did that in his life. Today we're going to look at the life of probably the most famous man in the New Testament after Jesus, the Apostle Paul. Okay, the Apostle Paul wrote a good amount of the New Testament, second only to Luke, who wrote more than Paul. But here we have Paul, who has a story, who has a before and after. So we want to look at his life. We want to see what God did with him. And we're going to start by asking the question, who was Paul before Jesus, right? Who was he before Jesus? And what does the Bible tell us about this guy named Paul? Now, I want to ask you, before we keep going, what do you already know about Paul? What do you know? He persecuted Christians. Okay, what else? Go ahead. What was that? He had worship rights? Shipwrecks. He was shipwrecked, absolutely, right? He was lost at sea, stranded. Anything else? What do we know? His name used to be Saul? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I hear you, but Paul was a Jew, and we're going to read that, but he grew up in a Roman city and had Roman citizenship, right? And Saul was his Hebrew name, and Paul is how he was known when he was around the Greeks, right? So oftentimes we think that, but that's not the case. There's other people that we see their name was changed in the Bible, for sure, but Paul has always been Saul and Paul at the same time, okay? A little weird for us, but it wasn't for them. Okay, let's read a little bit. Paul lets us know about himself in multiple places, okay? One of them we're going to look at is Acts 22, verse 3 through 5. Acts 22, Paul says, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. Here's Paul standing before this group of religious people, and he said, I'm a Jew just like you. And just before this, Luke writes that Paul began to speak in Hebrew, and immediately everybody was like, okay, this guy is one of us. He says, I'm a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in the city. So a couple of things about Paul. Obviously, he's Jewish, right? He has a knowledge of who God is. He believes in God, the same God that we believe in, Paul believed in, right? But he was following the view, the religion of Judaism, right? That was his understanding, and he was actually taught, his teacher was the best teacher you could have had in Judaism during this time. This guy, Gamaliel, historians say this is like top of the top. Like this guy will be teaching at one of the best universities in the country, in the world right now, right? If this was today. Paul was taught under him, and this was everything because this was his mentor. This was the man who taught him everything he knew about the Bible and how to study the Word of God and how to apply it. Now, he says that was him. He was very zealous. That is, he was very passionate for the things of God. Very, very passionate. He says, just like all of you that are listening to me today. Okay? So, it's not that Paul was ignorant of who God was. No. He knew who God was. He actually knew God's Word very, very well. He was one of the best. Now, his issue was his knowledge of God was not a saving knowledge. And what do I mean by that? You know, you can know about God. You can know all this information about God, but it doesn't mean that you're saved. And that was what was happening with Paul. He knew all these things about God, but he was not saved because his understanding of who God was wrong. He was missing a very important element that is what actually saves us. Here is what Paul actually did with that knowledge that he had of God. In verse 4, it says, I persecuted this way to the death. Now, I want you to pay attention. That word way there, notice that it's capital, right? I persecuted this way. That's our translators. As they're translating this into English, they want to help us out. And they're like, I want you to know that when Paul says this here, he's not just saying a way like in a general way. Here's what was happening. As the church takes on, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And during the first Christians, they began to be known as followers of the way. That's what they were called. The followers of the way. The followers of the way. And here's Paul saying, I persecuted this way. Almost like saying, I persecuted this movement that was taking place, Christianity. I persecuted this way to death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. So what did Paul do with Christians? He bind them, he delivered them to prison, both men and women. This was a man who's saying, I'm a Jew, I believe in God, I'm taught under the best teacher of the law of God, yet I am going to go ahead and persecute and kill Christians. There's something off, right? There's something that's not aligning here with the life of Paul. He continues in verse 5, it says, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness, from them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. So Paul lets them know, matter of fact, so you know that this is legit, so you know that what I'm saying is true, you can ask these people. They gave me this letter ordering me to go to Damascus to go and do this to the Christians there in this city called Damascus. Right? So he's speaking to these people. Eventually he's going to present the gospel, but he's starting by telling them a little bit about himself and who he was, right? As part of his strategy. In other places, Paul tells us more about himself. Galatians 1:13, for you have heard of my former life, the before, in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. You see that, right? Verse 14, and I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, so extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. So, Paul was standing out. He wasn't just a regular Jewish man who believed in God. He stood out. He was advanced. He was top of his class, right? He was getting the best grades. He was understanding things better than other people. He was able to teach it in ways that other people couldn't. Right? He had a passion and a desire for the things of God that other people didn't. Right? And he just put it to action, and he was on it. He says, I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. That was my story. That's who I was. That was my life. That's where I was going. And lastly, in Philippians 3:5-6, he says, circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law of Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. Here's Paul, once again, giving a little bit of his testimony. And this is only the first part, okay? This is only the first part of that testimony. But Paul, essentially, what he does here is he writes down a list of his accomplishments. He writes, if this was today, this is like a resume, something that you present with your skills, your accomplishments, who you are, what you've done, so that they will hire you. Right? And this is why you should take me on. And Paul said, I had a pretty good resume. I had a pretty good list of achievements, the best that there was. I had it all, right? I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. I'm not just Jewish. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm a Pharisee. I know the law of God better than just about anybody. Persecute the church because these people are standing against God. As to righteousness and the law, blameless. Paul said, in my eyes, in my perspective, I was essentially perfect. I obeyed the law of God perfectly. Everything that God said in His Word, I will follow it and I'll obey it perfectly. That was Paul's perspective before. That's the Paul before Jesus that we get in the Bible. But something happened in the life of Paul. What happened? Who knows? Absolutely, He did. He sure did. How did He do that? What happened? I thought you were raising your hand. Do you know? God blinded him, right? On his way to what? Damascus, on the road to Damascus, right? To do what? to get prisoners, to get Christians and imprison them and to kill them and all these things, right? On the road to be against the Lord, God appears to him, right? In a very powerful way, and Paul tells us a little bit. So we need to talk about the day Paul met Jesus, okay? Because this day changed everything in his life, and honestly, it's changed everything in our lives. This is a very important day in history. Acts 22, verse 6, and I was on my way and drew near to Damascus about noon. A great light from heaven suddenly shone around me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Now, we have no account so far of Paul actually ever meeting Jesus, right? Of actually knowing who he was personally, but here Jesus appears to him and says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Even though Paul was persecuting the Christians. You see, Jesus took this personally. You're persecuting my people, you're persecuting me. And then he follows that in verse 8, and I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Wow. Just imagine that, right? Oh yeah, I'm going to go to Damascus, I'm going to take care of all these Christians. It's going to be great. When I get back home, people are going to love me. They're going to sing me praises. They're going to say, Paul is so good. He's the best, right? And as I'm going there, now I'm confronted with the man that I'm going to persecute his followers. Now, those who are with me saw the light, but did not understand that the voice of the one who was speaking to me. So it's something unique, it's something miraculous that's taking place, where only Paul is understanding here what Jesus is saying to him. And I said, What should I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. God changes his life with this encounter. And we see that this is all part of God's plan. God, as you said, made him Christian. God took a hold of his life. He had a purpose to save Paul for a very, very special purpose. Now, this is the day that Paul met Jesus. But what happened after? What effect did Jesus have in his life? Well, let's continue some of these passages that we read. In Philippians 3, verse 7, he says, But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. He just finished giving us his list of accomplishments, right? I'm a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law of Pharisee, as to zeal of persecutor of the church, right? All of these things, this is why I'm so great. This is why I'm the greatest Jewish man ever, right? Essentially is what he's telling us. Whatever gain I had, Paul says, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. What Paul is saying is, these things were once very, very important and valuable to me. The fact that I was from the tribe of Benjamin, that I belonged to these people, that was my pride. I was so proud of being from the tribe of Benjamin. And man, I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. I obeyed the law of God perfectly. I was the most zealous and I was persecuting the most. I was doing all these things. That was like the best thing that I had. That was my gain, my profit. Whatever gain I had, it says I count as loss. Now, Paul says there was a shift, a change in my perspective and how I saw life. This used to be gain now is a loss, right? This used to be very important, now is actually a negative thing. That perspective and that attitude that I had to these things in my life, whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. That was the difference maker, right? That was the difference maker in his life. Indeed, it says in verse 8, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. Remember, last Friday we looked at this man who, there's a parable from Jesus, right? But he comes and he finds in this field a very, very precious pearl. And as he sees this, he says, this is so valuable that I'm going to go and I'm going to sell everything else that I have so that I can go and have this. Because it's so valuable, it's so precious, right, that it's worth everything else that I have. And I could care less if I don't have these things anymore because I have this. And Jesus says, the people who have this perspective, the people who see me in this way, theirs is the kingdom. Right? This is the kingdom of heaven. So now, here is Paul experiencing the same thing. Right? He's saying, I found something that is far better than all these accomplishments, all these things that I had done in my life. I have known Jesus. Like really know him, not just know facts about him, information about him. No, I really know him now, and that is far better than everything else I had. And I couldn't have both. I couldn't have Jesus and hold on to my pride and all these accomplishments and all these things that I had. And I gladly let it go because of the surpassing worth. Right? It's not that Paul now is going to live this miserable life because he's letting go of all this status and power and authority and praise that he had. No, he found something better. And we need to understand that when we're talking about Jesus, we're not talking about giving up a fun, exciting, great life for a miserable, boring, sad one that is limited. No, when we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about gaining. We're talking about something that is surpassing, that is way better, that is greater, of more value than anything else. And that's what Paul says. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish, as trash. That's Paul's perspective on all these things that were once very important to him. In order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, says, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith. Remember before, Paul said, as to the law, blameless. You bring the law of God, you bring those 10 commandments we spent 10 weeks on, right? And Paul would say, I obeyed all of them perfectly, blameless, all of it. Now he's saying, before I thought I was blameless. Before I thought I was righteous. That means somebody who does what is right before God, righteous. Before I thought that was me. Now I am actually righteous. I am actually right before God. But it's not because I obeyed the law, but because, says the righteousness from God that depends on faith. It comes through faith in Christ, right? Yeah, I'm right before God. I'm a person who does what is right, but the reason is because I put my faith in Jesus. The reason is because I put my faith in the one who was actually righteous, the one who was actually right before God. That's the difference. His hope, his confidence was no longer in Paul. It was in Jesus. In Galatians 2:20 it says, I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Wow. This is how Paul sees himself now. When he says, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, what does Paul mean? Obviously, it's still Paul living. It's still his body. He's still breathing. He still thinks, right? It's Paul. However, he no longer lived for himself. He lived for Christ. And more than that, the one who ruled his life was no longer Paul, it was Jesus. That is Christ who lives in me. You know, oftentimes we make the mistake that your Christian life, your walk with Jesus, is about what you can do for Jesus. Christianity is what Jesus is doing through you. That is the biggest thing. Right? It's not, I'm doing all these things for Jesus, therefore I'm a Christian, is what Jesus is doing through your life. It is Him who lives through you. Christ who lives in me. He rules me. He rules my life. Right? It's like if I was dead to myself, I no longer live for Paul, I live for Jesus. Lastly, we see a man who's been humbled. Take a look at 1 Corinthians 15:9 and 10. It says, For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and His grace toward me was not in vain. Paul goes from, I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews, I'm the best that there's ever been, to now, I'm the least of the apostles. And anything that I am today is because God was gracious to me, because God was kind, because God gave me that which I don't deserve. A man that was self-righteous, a man who trusted in his own good works and his ability to keep the law of God, who was proud of his identity, a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee, blameless in the law, a man who was violent and full of zeal against the church, a man who sat at the throne of his own life, now is humbled and transformed. That's Paul. No longer boasting and taking pride in who he is, but in who Jesus is. He is now a servant of Christ, right? He calls himself literally Christ's slave. It's somebody who's just obeying what Jesus has for his life, set apart for the gospel. He's a preacher of the gospel, right? And we know him as that. Devoted his life to spreading the message of Christ throughout the world. That's what he did. He was now a lover of the church. Once he destroyed it, now he's building it up. He suffered for Christ. He was beaten in prison, shipwrecked, mocked. Yet through it all, he was joyful. Through all of that, he was a man of grace and humility. He's a new creation, as he himself says it in 2 Corinthians 5:17. This is the before and after in the life of Paul. But without this day when Paul met Jesus, we won't have this Paul. We don't have these 13 letters from Paul. We don't have it. Paul would have still been going on in his own way, and we need to make note and we need to understand what happened in the life of Paul. And it's the truth that I want us to wrap up thinking tonight. And it's this, that the gospel changes how you see and value things. And this is essential to what the gospel does in the life of the Christian. Okay? It changes how you see and value things. That's another way of saying it changes your perspective in life. And we can think of the gospel as, in a way, we're putting on these glasses that you didn't have before, and through this new lens, you're able to see things that you couldn't see before. Right? Without them off, your vision was not very good. You didn't see things for the way they really are. You thought that that was a good thing, but actually it was not a good thing. And you thought that that was very important, but actually it wasn't very important. And you know once you put these glasses on. This is what happened in the life of Paul. Whatever gain I had now I count as loss, as garbage, because I found something better. God, when he saves a person, as we sang last Friday, he opens the eyes of our hearts. And he allows us to see things differently, things that we didn't see before. But what does this transformation actually look like? Obviously, we're not putting literal glasses on. God doesn't send from heaven down some special glasses that allow us to see things in life differently. But what does that transformation look like? When we think about the life of the Apostle Paul, I think we can picture it like this. Paul, throughout his life, had built himself his own kingdom. Okay? Now, kingdom, if you think of a kingdom, maybe in movies and cartoons, you think of a castle and you have a throne and you have a king, right? Every kingdom has a king. And a kingdom is the place from which a king rules, right? And establishes orders and rules and commands and so forth, right? Paul, throughout his life, had built his own little kingdom. And in that kingdom, he had a palace, a beautiful, beautiful palace. And at the center of that palace, at the center in the back, Paul had a throne, right? Something like this. This is beautiful. The moment you walked into this palace, there's a beautiful throne sitting in the back. And on that throne, you know who was sitting? Paul. There was Paul sitting in this throne, in this palace, in this kingdom that he had built. But Paul is telling us that one day, as he's sitting on his throne, there's a man who walks through the doors of his palace. And walks through the doors of this palace and begins to walk closer and closer towards his throne. And Paul is sitting there waiting to see what this man is going to do. And this man approaches Paul. And Paul tells us with a mix of authority but also kindness. It was a man with power but at the same time gentleness. And as he drew closer and closer to Paul, to eventually this man grabbed Paul out of his throne and took him to the side. And now Paul is just astonished as he's thinking through this. And little by little, what this man begins to do is not sit in his throne and take his place. Here's what this man does. He begins to, little by little, destroy this palace. He begins to destroy this palace piece by piece. And he starts to tear it down. And Paul is sitting there on the side watching as this man is destroying this kingdom that he's built his entire life. This beautiful palace that he has worked together. All that time sitting under this teacher. all this time learning and all his accomplishments and all this status that he's acquired, he's seeing this man come and tear it all down, destroy it. So eventually there was nothing but ruins on the ground. In his place, he sees now this man that walked in and took him out of his throne and started destroying his palace. He sees a man who begins to build a new palace. And this new palace is far greater in every way. Majestic, it's glorious, it's incredible. He also puts a new throne in the midst of this palace. He removes the old throne, he puts a new one in its place. And from this throne, this man was now going to rule and establish his new kingdom. And Paul, in the midst of this, he's just watching everything as it's taking place. Paul has gone now from being the king of his kingdom to now being at the feet in another man's kingdom. That's what happened with Paul. He's sitting at the feet of another man's kingdom. But the more that he began to look around this palace, and he begins to look at everything and how it worked, and as he looked at this man who was on the throne and how he reigned, and he looked at his absolute authority, his control, his power, the more he knew the king, the more he wanted to be a servant in this kingdom. The more he learned about this man, the more he wanted to be a part of it. And he noticed that something about everything in his life began to change. He noticed that his desires, his affections, his ambitions, and even his behavior began to change. And the more time he spent there, the more he realized that it is far greater to be a servant in this kingdom than a king in his own. Paul came to that conclusion. This man was obviously Jesus. And no, this story is not in the Bible. It's an illustration to tell you what's happening here with Paul. All this accomplishment, all this status, all this power, all this authority, all this praise, all this acceptance from people, all of these things was Paul's palace, his kingdom, and his throne. He enjoyed it. He was in control of his life. He loved it. One day when Jesus came to him on the road to Damascus, Jesus completely destroyed that kingdom, that palace, that throne, all of it. And in his place, he built a new one. And he established himself on that throne, and he sat on it. And he says, Paul, now I am going to be the king of this kingdom, and I am going to rule it. And Paul went from being a king in his own kingdom to a servant in another man's kingdom. But this man, of course, was Jesus Christ. You know why many people don't believe, don't follow the gospel of Jesus? Because they don't want to see their own kingdom fall apart. Is why so many people, it's not because there's not enough evidence about God. It's not because somebody said that the resurrection didn't happen. The biggest reason is because they don't want to see their kingdom fall. And what do we mean by that, by a kingdom in our own lives? Well, for Paul, it was all these things, right? His status, his acceptance by others, his power, his knowledge, his own view of himself as a very righteous person. But what about for you? Maybe is a kingdom of popularity and is wanting to be liked and noticed and admired by other people. Maybe is building this place, this kingdom of people who follow you, who like you, who give their attention, and you've made, in a way, your king just being accepted. And you have a deep desire to be accepted by people and to fit in and to be part of things. Maybe it's a kingdom of achievement, just like Paul, right? And as your grades or your sports or your music or other talents in your life, they become the center of who you are. That's the most important thing about me. Grades that you've gotten, test scores, praise from other people, feeling successful, smarter, or better than other people. Maybe that is your kingdom. Or how about the kingdom of control? Always wanting to go life to go your way. It has to go your way. Your friendships, your future plans. And you want everything to sort of be in your control, and you decide what is best for you. Always. Maybe it's the kingdom of comfort. You live for entertainment, hobbies, video games, sleeping. You fill your life with whatever feels good, and you don't want to be bothered or challenged in your life. You just want comfort. You want fun. And that's all you want. Or the kingdom of your looks. Obsessed with how you look, with what you wear, with how others see and think about what you wear and how you look. Always worried about having this, version of yourself that is perfect in the eyes of others. Or is approval, right, from others based on your appearance, your reputation. Or maybe it's a kingdom of relationships. You start building your life around a boyfriend or girlfriend or a friendship, and you find security and happiness in what you think this relationship can give you. As long as they love me, as long as they like me, I'm okay. Right? All of these things and so much more are little kingdoms in a way that we build for ourselves. It's little things that we say, this is what is most important in my life. This is what is most important about me. Right? And at the throne of your life is you. Jesus in the gospel makes it clear that he's not interested in sharing that throne. That throne belongs to him. He gets to sit there. He gets to make the calls. And we are his servants. We obey. We follow him, but he takes lead. The reality is every other kingdom, palace, and throne will eventually fall. They're all going to fall down and crumble. And God tells us that this is going to happen. In Daniel 2:44, and in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. This is true in a literal sense. This is true in just the illustrations that we're talking about here. With these little things that we build up in our lives, God will eventually bring this down. The reality is, Paul's kingdom was not as impressive as he thought it was. It wasn't as powerful and majestic as he thought it was, or he wasn't in control like he thought he really was. It didn't provide him security and stability like he thought it did. But he was now part of a kingdom that stood forever. That's what made all the difference. The one kingdom that reigns over every other kingdom. But what about you? You see, it's not just Paul that built for himself this own little kingdom. We all do. In one way or another. We all attempt to be at the center of the throne of our lives. We want to call the shots. We want to make the rules. So I ask you, are you still trying to be a king in your own kingdom? Or are you already a servant in the kingdom that lasts forever, the kingdom of Jesus? Regardless of your age, it is our natural tendency to do this. It is our natural tendency to give to other things what we're meant to give to God. To try to find in other things what we could only find in God. And maybe it is in your friendships, and your accomplishments, and your attitude, and your grades, and all these other things that you are finding and trying to get from that what only God can give you. The gospel changes how you see those things in your life. That's what it did to Paul. Once this was the most important. He had all these bragging rights and all these things, and I am the best. Now he says that was all garbage. How do you change somebody's mind in this way? Only the gospel of Jesus can do this. Only the gospel of Jesus. And he can do the same for your life. If you feel like this is what's taking place in your life, know that God will never, and you got to know this, God will never help you build your own kingdom. God is not going to help you do that. What I mean by that is God is not going to help you sin, essentially. If you make being successful in this world and avoiding the things of God the goal of your life, God is not going to help you. Now, sometimes God allows it to happen, but like we read here, like every kingdom eventually falls. God will absolutely help you when you are part of his kingdom, and he will help you build that up, and it will be great, and your life will always be worth it, and you'll never regret it. But know that God is not interested in helping anybody build any other kingdom that is not his. God won't do that. Now, one of the things we talked about in this series is that we want to ask somebody every week to come and share their testimony, right, of how Jesus changed their life. And this night we have the privilege of hearing from our brother Yims. So Yims, if you can come up here and share a little bit of how God changed your life and a little bit of your story. If you can grab a mic there from our Boñaño. All right, James, go ahead.
Hey everybody,